session for social media. So if you prefer not to be on camera, please take this time to turn off your cameras. And now, Phils, I'll pass the virtual mic over to you.
Well, thank you so much for the introduction, Jaslyn, and thank you everybody who came here today to listen to me talk about some of my work that's in the show. I guess I should start off by saying my name is Harrington. I'm an artist and educator. I'm a Black man with patchy facial hair. Some of my hair is dreading. It's underneath a Black kind of beanie, and I'm wearing a Black sweater. My background is blurred out. So today I'm gonna be reading mostly. So when I'm looking down, it's because I'm reading from like my notes, but I'm gonna be sharing my screen. Just give me 1 second just to make sure I'm on the right slide. All right. And can everybody see that? Just give me a thumbs up. Cool, awesome. All right, so the works that I'll be speaking about today are entitled Redox Strip and Steam Economies. And here we go, it's gonna start lagging. So also, I should note that if I jump back and forth between the slides, it's because Zoom on my end and my internet connection may be lagging. So I'll be talking about these two works which are in the show. And to contextualize these works, I'll be focusing on the Black inventor, Norbert Ryu, the economy of steam, and how I considered Ryu's invention of the multiple effect evaporator under vacuum to be an example of Black secret technology. Norbert Ryu was born in March of 1806 in New Orleans and was the oldest of 7 children. His father was a white man named Vincent Ryu, who was a chemical engineer that designed a steam-operated press for baling cotton. And his mother was a Black woman named Constance Viviant. And unfortunately, there's very little information available about her history and biography. As a teenager, Norbert was sent to France to study physics, mechanics, and engineering by his father. By the age of 24, Ryu was an instructor in applied mechanics at École Centrale in Paris. Around 1830, Ryu had published a series of papers on steam engines and steam power. However, none of his writings have survived. During his time in France, Ryu began working on his notable invention, the multiple effect evaporator under vacuum, a system that was designed for efficiently using latent heat from steam to evaporate water, or in the case of Ryu, sugarcane juice. Ryu's awareness of the steam economies, which can be affected by repeated use of the latent heat in the steam vapors, became the basis for all modern industrial evaporation and continues to be. For Ryu, the plantation was his laboratory, and the praxis of harnessing the energy of vapors found in latent heat was his chosen scientific method. I find it compelling that Ryu's innovation is grounded in the scientific principle of latent heat. On an etymological level, the root of the word latent heat means to lie hidden. Latent heat can be understood as energy in hidden form, which is supplied or extracted to change the state of a substance without changing its temperature, a transition or a change in phases. Before Ryu's invention, 19th century sugar processing was limited to the sugar train, Jamaica train, or Spanish train method. In these systems, teams of enslaved people ladled boiling sugarcane juice from one open kettle to another. Throughout this process, some sugar was lost because of spillage. And since there wasn't an efficient procedure to monitor the heat levels of each kettle, a significant amount of sugar was burned. This system was dangerous for workers who would suffer from burn injuries, and it caused considerable high costs in fuel because of its inability to regulate heat. The multiple effect evaporation system was a safer, cheaper, and more efficient way of evaporating sugarcane juice. Ryu would work on his invention for over a decade before he is hired to install the system on the Belle Chase plantation. This particular plantation was owned by Judah Benjamin, who was at the time a lawyer, but would later serve for the Confederacy as a Secretary of War. When Ryu arrived to install his invention on Louisiana plantations in the South, he did so as a consultant. But under the law, he was still a Black man who could only reside and enter and sleep in the same quarters as those who were enslaved. So I guess for me, there are times when I'm looking at the history of Ryu that he lived within a certain complexity and carried this ambivalence while navigating the antebellum South. The multiple effect evaporation system that is designed by Ryu posits, reorients, and rearranges the relationship between Black liberation and Black invention. The primary drive for invention has always been need. The necessity is the mother of invention. But is any invention liberated under the grips of capitalism and exploitative labor? Those who were enslaved that operated the sugar train method are not entirely liberated through Ryu's invention. Their exploitative and violent labor was relieved from taking on sugar processing, but it was not untethered from being perceived as an abject object. Norbert Ryu has a complicated history. The chemical engineer and the creation of his multiple effect evaporator sits somewhere between heroic myth and alchemy. The process of purifying, refining, sampling, and harnessing energies that lie hidden in form yields a generative site to reinvent embodied knowledge in the Platocratic laboratory. So when I say Black Secret Technology, I have to admit that it's not my own. It's the title of an album by musician Gerald Simpson, who is also known as a guy called Gerald. His album, Black Secret Technology, was produced in 1995 and is regarded as one of the best jungle breakbeat albums of our time. However, I understand Black Secret Technology as a coded system of knowledge that streams and circulates throughout Black cultural production. Analogous to alchemy, its inherent meaning is not always rendered on the surface, but instead it requires the procedure of decoding or distilling to capture its precise meaning. Black Secret Technology is the interdisciplinarity of creative labor and lived experience that endorses a poetics of being. It situates knowledge. Black Secret Technology refuses to rely solely on the racial underpinnings of empirical knowledge production. It unmakes and contours these edges of these knowledge production systems. Ryu, the history of his invention and its significance for a covert tradition of Black secret technology has inspired my work, Redox Strip. When I started working on the sculpture, I knew that I wanted to create a stage to configure a scene for Black cultural production and invention. The actors or agents for that scene were Frantz Fanon, DJ Screw, and Norbert Ryu, and a guy called Gerald. I wanted to see the possibility of how these actors could interanimate and work together and collaborate together. In some kind of way, you could think about this as an alchemical affinity. I wanted to know how one could capture the state of transition between these cultural producers? Is it possible for a chemical reaction to illustrate the biochemical processes that Frantz Fanon speaks of? Redox drip. So, okay, I guess I should stop here. This is an image of DJ Screw working in his living room. And something that struck me was the speaker you see here on the ground facing the wall. When I saw this image, it was really, kind of inspired me for a sculptural move in how I wanted to install my own work. But I also understand that that's a way to like create a reverb or almost like a subwoofer, if you will, when you don't have one. So redox strips is a sculpture assembled with speakers, tape cassettes, NyQuil, spray, DJ Screw's Diary of an Originator album, Behringer mixer, a stereo double cassette deck, magnetic stirrers, Graham condensers, a stereo receiver, an iodine clock reaction, glass flasks, styrofoam cups, plastic storage bins, sound absorption material, contact mics, plastic tubing, water, zip ties, steel panel, a two-way vacuum distilling adapter angle, another distilling adapter, and a Klassen adapter and a two-way connecting distilling tubes. In some other iterations of this work, the speakers play to each other. And this is how they are playing, two speakers playing to each other. In other instances, the work is cornered and one speaker plays against the wall, giving the audience its back at all times. Redox strip aims to revive neglected legacies of Black invention and challenges modernist narratives of scientific advancement. It enables the emergence of new and transformative knowledge systems by setting a stage in which live chemical reactions, overlooked archives, and interdisciplinary creations can meet, circulate, absorb, and distill. But I still had some lingering questions about what Black secret technology is and what it does with the histories of Black methodology and cultural production. Could the construction of my own distillation system bring forth the untold history and narrative of Norbert Ryu? Or does it conjure the absence of the inventor? Who and what has been faded out or silenced in the archives? How do I recover, recuperate, retell forgotten and shared histories? The failure in oral traditions and documentation fragments the histories of those who sit outside of dominant social narratives. The power and authority of the archive and place constraints on what should and what should not be acquired and what should not be known. So these are some tubes that are connected to some water pumps in a plastic storage bin that essentially their job is to cool down the condenser distillation tubes. And they need to cool them down because I have a round bottom flask that's at a pretty high heat temperature, distilling the Sprite and NyQuil that I've been kind of processing for the last couple of years each time I install it. And also what you're seeing is like a mixer on top of a stereo receiver, which is plugged into the speakers. And also this kind of glass, with water and kind of brown, substance on it, has a microphone that can be submerged in water. So when you go and see the work installed, what you're hearing is this turning of this liquid, which is combination of a few different chemical reactions like the iodine clock reaction. But after it's dissolved, it just turns clear after it's already been turned to like a black liquid before. So the work Steam Economies attempts to address these questions by thinking through reuse application of latent heat. In Steam Economies, I use a tablet privacy filter, which is normally used for one's privacy from someone looking over your shoulder in public spaces, and provides a blackout privacy from people viewing your screen from different sides outside of the 60-degree viewing angle of your device. Behind this privacy filter is the formula of latent heat in white wavy letters inscribed onto a black and white image of Norbert Ryu, where specific latent heat, L, expresses the amount of energy in the form of heat, Q, required to completely affect a phase change of unit of mass, M. With this work, I'm still trying to come to terms with Ryu's complexity as a historical figure, the relationship between Black invention and Black liberation, being seen and not being seen. In the archives of invention, the ambivalence of Ryu's positioning himself in relationship to the analytics of Black enslaved labor. So when you go and see this work, depending on what position you are located in relationship to the work, sometimes you see this image and other times you'll just see a completely Black square. That's kind of the end of my talk for today. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, unless we need to go back to some images to talk about.
Thanks so much. Okay. I'm now in a reverb room, so hold on one second.
Well, if we're gonna hop into like the Q&A, I can ask the question that came to mind. I'm trying to think of where to actually start. I've been jotting down a list, just like reflecting on just becoming more familiar with your work than I already am. But I guess thinking about like Black poetic science and inventions, there seems to be like layers of metaphors that are that you're working through in your sculptures. And I don't want you to have to give any of like your secrets away in this like secret Black technology. But I'm just wondering if like you could expand more on some of the like metaphors, particularly in redox drip, especially like with when you're like talking about I guess like the night quill, and like what is there like a metaphor that you're tapping in through there, and like what was your thought process in choosing that as a metaphor?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the question. And also, I'll respond to questions in the chat as well if someone wants to write something instead of saying something. I have no secrets. I am willing to talk about everything and anything. And so when I was working on this sculpture a few years ago, I was a bit, kind of consumed by Ryu's patent drawings and trying to really understand what this multiple effect evaporator system was doing. And I'm not a scientist or an engineer, I'm an artist, so I have to quickly grasp ideas and concepts through what's available from reading, watching YouTube videos, etc. And what I came to understand is like that there is some type of distillation process happening in this system. That's not what it is, but there's some distilling feature happening. And I was like, okay, I could possibly distill something. I could possibly make my own distillation system. And so I like called around different chemical glass grade producers that were willing to talk to me about how one could distill something. And after being on the phone with a couple people, I realized that it was possible, and it was, you know, not that difficult. But then it was a question of what to distill. And a lot of my work sometimes kind of looks back into my own past. I've done work about, you know, my relationship with my own hair. Did a performance where I was thinking about how I used to use like a bunch of chemicals on my hair, and that was directly from a moment in as a teenager, and then wanting to readdress it through performance and making. And this was a similar situation where it was like I'm looking back to my own lived experience to try to address like what I'm interested in the present. And the present was Norbert Ryu, and looking at his biography and like how he came into being an inventor by way of living this kind of, you know, privileged life that's a bit complicated. You know, there's not a lot of writings of his own account, so there is a lot of assumption on the authors that I'm reading, and then myself included. But you know, I wanted to like think about, you know, that complexity and think about my own lived experience to think through what materials could be distilled. And again, going back to like my teenage years in high school and thinking about other cultural producers that I'm really, you know, interested in, like DJ Screw, and how a lot of my friends grew up listening to, you know, the Screwed Up Click. And, you know, a lot of us just being really young and like wanting to experiment on our own with what DJ Screw and others were doing, which was like drinking codeine and 7-Up and Sprite and driving around, you know, and going to parties or whatever. So knowing that I couldn't get a hold of codeine because you can't do that anymore, like it's not the late 90s or early 2000s, I tried to do the next best thing, which was use Sleepy Time NyQuil or other NyQuil or other sleepy, you know, things that had a similar effect on the body, which was to slow things down, right? Or slow the body down, or slow the mind down, or relax the body in some type of way, and create my own crude version of like what is considered to be lean, or, you know, whatever. Mud, you know, has so many different names depending on where you're geographically located, I guess. And then, yeah, combine that with some Sprite. And so when you look at the work, there's this black kind of substance brewing, and that's the same stuff. That's like one of the many substances, but it's like kind of the same one. I like to think of it as that for you know, since 2019, I guess, is when I first installed it. I never emptied it, so I just add more NyQuil and add more Sprite to it, you know, to get it going for the next time it's installed. Yeah, and I guess like metaphor is an interesting thing to think about. I'm not too literal when I'm making and producing these things. I am thinking through some type of, you know, I'm thinking through something that's analogous to something else, I guess. I like to think about the history of alchemy and alchemical productions as like, you know, it's not a true or hard science, but it's a way to get at science that skirts around, you know, the more, I guess, academic ways of observing it. And because most of the time I'm working with materials that I can purchase like at a pharmacy store down the street, or or a deli or bodega or wherever I can get my hands on, because I don't have, institutional access at all times. Like, I think working through metaphor or with metaphor is more about accessibility to materials and what I have, and trying to like really contour these areas that are concerned with empirical knowledge production. Um, yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question, but some of the things I was thinking about when making it initially.
It provides insight, which is helpful to just, when you're talking through this, like now I'm actually like envisioning you putting it together. Even like when you were describing the steps of like how you put it together before, like I still was just like more so thinking about the actual objects. But like hearing the personal connection to it allows me to actually envision you in that process and like how this relates to you on even a more personal level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, at the time of this work, I think I was, trying to work with what I was calling an inner subjective position. And meaning that, initially, I know that I'm interested in science. I know that I get excited at, watching chemical reaction GIFs. I know that those are things that are just fun for me. But how to apply them to what I produce as an artist can be really tricky. And not having some, I guess, intimacy or some type of something that feels closer to the personal feels, I don't know, it doesn't feel true, or it doesn't feel honest. Maybe it's something about honesty and trust. And maybe that's the reason why I was working this way, around redox strip, right? And I should say that like when making works, I'm pretty slow, especially with sculpture, because I'm doing like multiple things at once. I'm reading and I'm researching, across different disciplines and fields of information and knowledge. And the the sculpture redox strip went through many different iterations, from the first image I showed to the last image I showed. It's like been reduced down and kind of pared down because there were so many things I wanted to pull back from and put back in, and felt like I was overcomplicating the idea. So, but the first time that I installed it, it was like, trying to think through what was directly connected to me in my own experience, and then also what was like available as like an overlap between my own research and what I was thinking about. I see that there's a question in the chat. I'm just going to read it out loud.
Sure.
Some very simple questions that I think you might have answered already is is there sound and music playing in the installation? Does the speaker system interact with the distillation process, or is it more of a collage of these overlapping processes? Thank you for that question. I don't think I talked too much about the sound and music. So when you go to see the work in this show, there's no music, but there is sound. And what you're hearing is a microphone that's been submerged in a liquid that's on a magnetic stirrer. Magnetic stirrers are usually for doing chemical reactions or other types of processes, and I think chemistry and other fields of science, but I'm using it, I guess I'm misusing it. So instead, what you hear is like this liquid turning, and I have that going through a mixer that has some, distortion and delay. And so getting closer to the work itself, like physically closer, you hear this ambient track being produced from the sculpture. Other times I've had an audio track that's a combination of people giving talks everywhere from Horton Spillers. I've done talks with like, DJ Screw giving an interview on the local news, and just trying to situate all of them together to come to terms of like, again, thinking through this, like what happens when all of these people, all of these like cultural producers like work collaboratively together, trying to, um, get to another level of meaning, get to another kind of poetics of being by, layering up sound and music and material. But for this show in particular, it's quieter. And yeah, I guess like a collage is one way of thinking about it. There are many different components. I don't think about it as a collage. I haven't really said that. I've always thought about it as like a stage, or like inner animation is like a word I like to use a lot, because it is like, a thing of a multiple happening, right? But multiples where they come from very different and distinct areas of sites of production, whether it's like, theory, or if it's music, or if it's science, etc.
So I had another question about, yeah, the work itself does seem like it is an extension of performance, and I'm curious to hear if that's something that you're going to incorporate into your practice. You've mentioned that you've done it in the past, but I'm just curious if that's something you're still interested in.
Yeah, I'm like very interested in performance, and I like to, and I have done it in the past with a different work called Approximation of the Mix, where I followed some instructions online to make a acoustic levitator, which is just basically a device that uses sound to levitate very small objects, and then performed with that object. But again, it was like kind of an overlapping or a collage, if you will, or, working with a script that I made that is thinking from the instructions of S-curl, which is a chemical product that I used to put in my hair that would straighten my hair. But I also think about redox strip as a sculpture that performs. It is a performative thing. It's doing something without me. And I also have like performed with that sculpture in other ways by mostly manipulating the sound that it's producing. Um, so just maybe pulling out certain tones and levels of the bass and the highs as a way to activate the sculpture. Yeah. So there's this thing of activation that happens with redox strip and other iterations of its presentation. And for the future, yeah, I mean, there's always opportunities for me to perform. I usually take them on as like mostly as a performer who activates a thing or activates another sculpture, not so much as like a performer that moves through dance or moves through other means of more traditional ways of thinking through performance art. Not to say that those are not available to me. But yeah, I mean, to answer the question, yes, it has come up.
And so was that live, like when you were, you know, adjusting and morphing the sound?
Yeah, it was live. Yeah, I would. Are you talking about the approximation of the mix, or the other iteration of redox strip?
Both. I'm curious
Okay.
if it was like live before an audience.
Yeah. So with approximation of the mix, it was a performance for the live cameras, like meaning that there is a camera that was routed to a projector, and it was showing my hands and the acoustic levitator, and then throwing that image onto a wall. But my position in relationship to the audience, I was behind them. So even though I was present in the room, they had to look back to see what was happening, even though they could see what right in front of them. And then with Redox Strip, I was there in front of, you know, the group, and you know, turning knobs, I guess, and in a live setting.
Mixing. You were like embracing DJ Screw.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. Mhm.
I'll pass to Richard.
Okay.
Can you hear me? I'm not sure if this mic works. Okay. I'm so really interested in how you are looking back at the inventor, Norbert Villiers. I'm probably saying his his
Me
name
too.
wrong, but
I probably said it wrong the whole time.
How much did you do work, research his life and practice, and are you going to do more work about him, or in general, it's not revisionist exactly, but a rediscovering of a history of technology invention? Is that something that you think you want to do more, kind of going back and revisiting technologies that might have invented specifically from a Black perspective? Or how do you think about this? Or does this feel more like a one-off thing that you explored with this work?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of for you, I'm not too sure how much there is I can, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot that I could, talk about with his biography and his history, but I'm not too sure if I want to continue to, work with him as an inventor and his invention. But never say never, I guess. But my more like recently I've been still thinking in, I guess, you know, mid, 18th, mid to late 18th century, early 19th century history of science and technology, but looking at, the spirometer, which is a tool or an instrument in medicine that is used to measure the volume of air in your lungs or lung capacity. And I started looking at that after reading Lundi Braun's book, Breathing Race into the Machine, because she has a chapter called, I think, Black and White Lungs, where she's looking at the history of Union soldiers, Union Black soldiers, being measured from head to toe, from the measurement of their skulls to the size of their chest, to how tall they are, their weight, etc., and also their lungs, their capacity of their lungs, and that being a variable or a measurement to determine the will or determine the value of their life against white lungs or white soldiers, right? The physician who carries it out kind of disregards living conditions between, that are distinctly different between the two groups of people, right? The white soldiers and the Black soldiers. And so the work that I did recently called What Remains is Constant. I'm working in a 2D space, a 2D digital space, where I produce these digital illustrations that use, statistical life tables, logos from Prudential Life Insurance Company, because they end up using those variables and those measurements to determine whether or not they want to give life insurance to African Americans. I use the graphic of the spirometer itself, and also trying to map these kind of what I was calling entropic pathways, of how like life is valued, right? With the use of a scientific instrument that's supposedly objective, right? The instrument, the tool itself is objective until its operator has a bias. And I think a lot about those histories and trying to figure out how they map themselves into the present. You know, and one way I guess we could think about it is like how, you know, algorithms work or AI works, you know, when it's like the algorithm itself is not racist, but it's its creator, right? Its operator that has bias. That's and you know that's like tied to the code itself, right? And it tells the code where to look and how to look, right? So yeah, in terms of like still thinking about the history of science and technology, it is still present, but it's in a different direction from I guess Norbert Ryu and DJ Screw, and trying to find a way to think more specifically of like how you know, scientific racism is invented into existence, right? Instead of just, you know, thinking through these other metaphorical ways of looking at scientific racism, I guess, is one way of thinking about it. But yeah. And so there's another question in the chat from Jaslyn. Can you revisit alchemy and how that relates to Black or further more hood avant-garde? Sure, yeah, I can go back to alchemy. I guess for me, I guess for the work of Redox Strip, I think there was something alchemical in how I came to produce the work, and alchemical in the sense that I was trying to situate knowledge and situate culture production amongst you know, very specific people and musicians and thinkers that I was looking at the time. So Frantz Fanon, a guy called Gerald, Norbert Ryu, DJ Screw, and many others. And I think I see alchemy as like something that is on the exterior of, you know, dominant forms of knowledge production, right? So even by, you know, the means of how the work got created by, you know, not relying on just institutional access to, you know, chemical grade glass and distillation equipment, you know, like that, those were purchased, you know, online, and talking to some random person in Canada that was willing to sell it to me. Normally these like pieces of equipment don't come into one's hands if you're not like a chemist or someone else. You have to have certain license to these instruments and equipment. The speakers themselves was like, I think I bought it from some guy at his storage space. And then the Diary of Originator album that's shown in the first iteration of the work was like purchased directly from DJ Screw's store that's still being ran by, I think, a family member. And of course, again, like just making the really crude version of NyQuil and Sprite or Lean or whatever, or mud, you know, is another means of like, and you know, my way of thinking about what alchemy is, which is like not having the access to a real lab, or not having access to, you know, high grade materials or equipment, but making means with producing still, you know, a demonstration or experiment with what's accessible to you, right? So there's this kind of contouring of knowledge, or this contouring of production that I kind of, is a way that I relate to alchemy, right? And the affinities happen through the alchemical production by way of who I'm putting next to each other or one another, or who I put in conversation with one another, right? At the time, I hadn't seen or witnessed anyone trying to situate DJ Screw with Frantz Fanon, and also, or a guy called Gerald and Frantz Fanon, and like trying to organize or reorient all these people together was a way of thinking through the process as alchemical, for me personally. But I know alchemy has many different meanings, and and it has like many different ways of approaches in terms of its methodology, right? But again, like it was like a way to organize or reorganize or resituate, actors or agents that I hadn't seen, put next to each other. I hope that answers the question in some roundabout way.
No, it definitely does answer the question. I mean, I just put in the chat that just hearing about the production process itself, and then, not even just like, the artists and inventors that you're referencing in the piece, but just even like, this quote unquote supply chain and like the other people that are involved indirectly in your process of putting this together, and how that relates to just, what it means to be put into a situation where you just have to make do with what you do have, and you know try to find, just try to bring something together from having a lack of resources. Yeah, just like it adds like a deeper level of meaning and understanding to the piece.
Thank you.
I think this is less of a question, but more of a comment. I find it fascinating how I feel like there's a certain fearlessness or spontaneity working with, you're bringing so many different voices together, even in this one work, and bringing them into context with each other, and especially the historical figures. I'm just really inspired by your approach. I don't know if you can talk about that a bit more around, there's the research component, but then there's also the connecting that with the very personal and I guess the spontaneity.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I guess like in terms of just like as an artist, and my own practice, I think at times I spend more, maybe a little bit too much time with reading and research, or whatever research is. I think research can be a lot of different things, but I will, I think, do that longer than I need to actually produce the work itself. And like what really ends up happening is that after looking across all these different books or texts or essays or whatever it is, songs, music in any way, or a talk online, I just, in a really weird way of saying it, I just kind of like let it all release, like a almost, kind of, I don't know, just spitting it all out at once, and not being like, okay, I'm just going to put this here and that there and this word, and this, that place, to contextualize everything. It makes more sense to just like have everything next to each other. But, and I think that's, one of the ways that I like to work. And I think that way of like, when I say like a poetics of being, or like, trying to find like, a way to have creative labor, lived experience, situated next to each other. It's more about like how do you get towards new ways of living or new ways of thinking. And I guess I take that a little bit from how both Catherine McKittrick and Sylvia Wynter think through the science of the word, which is directly from Aimé Césaire, and for them, I guess what I grasped onto is just like this idea of like it's both myth or it's both like myth and the biological, or it's both the social, the cultural, the poetic and the scientific. It's not just one or the other. And so for me personally, it actually operated in the same way, right? It's just like I can't just look at the science. I can't just look at my own lived experience. I can't just look at music, but I had to look at all of them as like a kind of conglomerate of ways of thinking through what it means to be in a world where you're living through complexity, or you're living through a kind of complicated history, or you're living through these territories of ambivalence, right? It's not just one or the other. It's not so much a dichotomy, but it's more of a cosmology or something like this. And recently it's been more heavy-handed with the research. I think I spend more time there, and I don't know if that's like because of I'm trying to figure out how to be an artist through a pandemic and like in a post-studio life. Like I tend to look towards writing as a means of working or making. I look towards working directly with images that I find through what I'm reading, whether it's graphics or illustrations of instruments or statistical tables, because that's where my mind's at right now is statistics and risk and like these instruments of objectivity. There's 2 questions in the chat from Jocelyn. The process itself seems to be an integral part of your work. What are your thoughts on writing, expanding on this aspect of work? And the other question, it puts me in the mind of personal scientific journal and notebook. Cool. Thank you, Jocelyn. Yeah, I mean, and who are the 2 thinkers I just mentioned? Didn't catch their names. Oh, Sylvia Wynter, Catherine McKittrick. Yeah. And then I guess to answer Jasmine's question, yeah, what are my thoughts on writing? I mean, there's a lot of things that I think about in terms of writing. I'm not a writer. Like it takes me forever to write something and think about something, and having the having the confidence to put something down on paper. I really admire people who have like a strong writing practice. But it kind of came into my life, I think just a few years ago, more actively and presently, because it's a lot easier to work through writing to come towards like an idea that can then be delivered in the means of a physical space or a physical object. And it also gave me an opportunity to think about how to get out of like my own headspace when doing a lot of research or reading, right? Is like directly taking from what I was reading and then just like putting it in my own notes, and then eventually coming to terms with like some things to kind of put together in the essay form. And I guess also being in a pandemic when there's not a lot of access to space in general, and there's not a lot of people. I mean, now we're, I guess, in this weird zone of the pandemic where there are shows still happening, and not so much doing exclusively virtual things. But at the time I started writing about as work or as like as an art practice. I was thinking about other means or of like how to get around not being physical in a space, and also how to share my thoughts and my own research, right? Because when you encounter the work Redox Strip, I don't think you have all of that information that I just said in these last, 30, 40 minutes, right? You see like some brown stuff in the flask, and you see some speaker facing a wall, and you hear some weird ambient track of maybe water turning. But there was so much more to the work for me, and I, know I'm not always going to have the opportunity like I do right now to share it. But instead, with writing it, it gave me the space to express where these thoughts were coming from and how they were coming together. And also gave me an opportunity to like kind of route the way I think, because I guess it is in like a windy way where it's like, it does make sense to constellate, for me personally, like what Ryu is doing with the history of sugar and what DJ Screw is doing with his music and slowing things down, and what Fernan is thinking about, in terms of like detection and being seen and not being seen, and how to like put that with, the iodine clock reaction. Like these things make sense in my mind, but as a physical object, they may not always be, present. So through writing, it was like, it does feel a bit more expansive in this way, right? Because I can, use different devices and different writing styles to, access that way of displaying my thought or displaying the routes of my thought, right? Whether it's linear or non-linear, or it's like situating itself in the metaphor or not.
Okay, I think we're at time. So thank you so much, Fields, for sharing your work with us and generously answering all the questions. And thanks so much, Jaslyn. And everyone, please do make sure to check out the work at the New School Gallery. Fields is also part-time faculty at the school, so try to catch a class with him.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's great to talk to you all.